At midnight, my daughter-in-law called me sobbing. "Please, you have to save us. We're going to lose the lake house." I thought I was helping my son's family secure their dream home. 24 hours later, I realized exactly what they thought my generosity was worth. I never expected my quiet retirement in Oregon to be disrupted by a frantic midnight phone call. My son Mark sounded completely panicked on the receiver, while his wife Sienna was sobbing so loudly in the background that I could barely hear him. Sienna grabbed the phone and practically screamed into my ear, begging me to save them. She pleaded that they found their dream lake house near Lake Oswego, but their loan application hit an unexpected wall at the absolute last minute. She swore they would lose their earnest money deposit and their future happiness if I didn't step in immediately to buy it outright. I am a retired structural inspector, 64 years old, and a widow who values financial prudence above all else. I didn't make a reckless decision. I agreed to purchase the property entirely in my name as a sole legal owner. I saw it as a generous family investment where they could live while paying me monthly rent to cover property taxes and maintenance. Within 3 weeks, the title was clear, the funds were transferred from my savings, and the keys were officially handed over to me. I felt a deep sense of maternal satisfaction, believing I had provided a stable foundation for my son's young family. However, the very next afternoon, I drove out to the lake house with a trunk full of basic tools to check the water heater valves. When I pulled up the gravel driveway, I noticed a silver sedan parked in the primary spot. I walked up the front porch steps, pulled out my master set of keys, and inserted the brass key into the front deadbolt. The lock didn't turn at all. The cylinder was completely stiff and newly installed. Before I could process what was happening, the front door swung wide open, revealing Sienna's mother, Evelyn, standing inside with a fresh set of shiny silver keys dangling arrogantly from her fingers. Evelyn didn't offer a greeting or invite me inside the house I had purchased 24 hours earlier with my life savings. She merely tilted her head, adjusted her cardigan, and informed me that the locks had been changed earlier that morning for security reasons. When I asked why I hadn't been given a key to my own property, Sienna emerged from the kitchen carrying unpacked boxes. She smiled weakly and explained that her mother needed complete, unhindered access because she was managing the interior decoration and supervising contractor visits. Sienna then looked me dead in the eye and said her mother had the only spare key because too many sets would create confusion. I stood on the porch, feeling a cold wave of realization wash over my chest, though I kept my posture perfectly rigid. My son Mark walked out from the hallway, avoiding direct eye contact while nervously scratching the back of his neck. He mumbled that Sienna's idea made sense for now, suggesting I didn't need a key since I lived 40 minutes away in my suburban bungalow. They treated me like an intrusive landlord rather than the mother who had just saved them from financial embarrassment. I didn't raise my voice, drop my toolbox, or engage in an unproductive emotional argument on the doorstep. Instead, I calmly asked Sienna if her mother planned on paying the upcoming county property tax assessment alongside her decorating duties. Sienna laughed off the remark as a joke, but I simply nodded, turned around, and walked back down to my car. As a former inspector, I knew that structural integrity isn't just about foundation beams. It's about boundaries. On my drive home, I decided not to throw a fit, but I immediately canceled the joint home insurance policy draft I had prepared for them. If they wanted complete operational control of the lake house, they would have to face the cold reality of its actual running costs. On Monday morning, I didn't call Mark to complain about Evelyn keeping the only spare key to the lake house. Instead, I altered my daily routine entirely, driving straight to my local bank branch in downtown Portland, rather than my usual garden center. I met with my longtime financial advisor and formally restructured the payment terms regarding the lake house property management. Originally, I planned to let Mark and Sienna pay a discounted internal family rate covering only basic municipal utility bills and minimal upkeep fees. I revised the agreement into a formal binding lease draft reflecting full market value, rental rates, standard commercial terms, and strict tenant obligations. Later that evening, Mark stopped by my house alone under the pretense of dropping off my mail from last week. He sat at my kitchen island, nervously tapping his fingers on the granite counter while sipping a glass of iced tea. I handed him the newly printed lease agreement without saying a word, letting the black ink speak clearly for itself. He scanned the document, his eyes widening in shock when he saw the monthly figure and the strict maintenance clauses. He stammered that Sienna was expecting them to live there virtually rent-free so they could save up money for a new SUV. I looked at my son calmly and reminded him that property ownership involves continuous capital expenditure insurance liabilities and structural maintenance. He argued that families shouldn't operate like a commercial corporation, but I pointed out that changing deadbolts was a commercial action. Mark tried to defend Sienna, claiming she was just trying to help her mother feel useful after her recent retirement move. I didn't argue back or express anger. I simply told him the signed lease was due back to me by Friday evening. If they chose not to sign, I explained smoothly, the property would immediately be handed over to a professional leasing agency. Mark left my house, looking visibly shaken, carrying the paper lease like a heavy weight in his trembling hands. 3 days later, I drove to the lake house unannounced during the early afternoon, parking my car down the street near the public boat launch. I walked along the perimeter tree line to inspect the exterior foundation walls, a habit from my decades working as a building inspector. Through the large ground-floor double windows facing the water, I saw Sienna and her mother Evelyn sitting at the dining table with an architect. They had large blueprints spread across the wood table, actively pointing at structural bearing walls, separating the kitchen and living room. I stepped closer to the glass frame and clearly overheard Evelyn discussing plans to demolish the load-bearing partition to create an open concept. Sienna was nodding enthusiastically, taking notes on a legal pad while discussing contractor quotes and aggressive construction timelines for next month. Neither of them had consulted me, submitted a formal modification request, or even mentioned structural alterations to the actual property owner. They were treating my life savings as their personal canvas, operating under the assumption that my maternal quietness meant absolute compliance. I took out my smartphone and quietly recorded a clear 2-minute video of the blueprints and their detailed conversation through the window. As an inspector, I knew tearing down that specific wall without proper steel beam reinforcement would compromise the entire upper roof structure. They were willing to damage the integrity of the building simply to satisfy Evelyn's personal aesthetic desires for an open layout. Instead of bursting through the front door to confront them, I carefully walked back to my parked car along the tree line. I realized then that this was no longer just about an extra key or disrespectful family dynamics. It was about protecting my assets. Sienna and her mother believed they had maneuvered me into a corner where motherly affection would force my silent financial compliance. They didn't realize that 30 years of reading architectural blueprints had taught me exactly how to identify structural weaknesses in any plan. That night, I sat at my wooden desk looking at old photographs of Mark as a boy fishing with his late father. The emotional sting was real, but I refused to let nostalgia blind my judgment regarding the current situation with Sienna. I drafted a formal legal notice declaring an unauthorized alteration attempt on the Lake Oswego property, citing the recorded conversation from that afternoon. My hand hovered over the paper as I pondered whether to send it directly to Sienna or handle it through formal legal channels. Mark called me around 8 o'clock, his voice sounding tired and strained over the quiet hum of his home office background. He asked if I could come over for dinner on Sunday, framing it as a peace offering from Sienna to clear the air. I accepted the dinner invitation calmly, but I made a quiet, firm decision not to bring the unsent legal notice with me. Instead, I spent the rest of the evening organizing all original purchase receipts, title deeds, and inspector reports into a single fireproof folder. I also contacted my former colleague, a licensed master locksmith, who ran a commercial security firm in the city, scheduling him for Monday. If Sienna and Evelyn believed that possessing the only spare key gave them absolute operational authority, they were gravely mistaken about legal reality. I went to bed early, sleeping peacefully, because I was no longer reacting out of hurt feelings or surprise. I was operating with a clear, methodical strategy, treating the lake house as the legal entity and investment property it actually was. The next morning, I tended to my backyard garden, pruning the rose bushes with precise, deliberate cuts to remove dead growth. When you allow overgrown branches to take over a garden, they eventually choke out the healthy plants that actually sustain life. The same rule applies to family relationships that lack clear, enforceable boundaries regarding respect, honesty, and financial responsibility. Sunday dinner at Mark and Sienna's rented apartment was an exercise in carefully calculated politeness and subtle social manipulation. Sienna served roast chicken, constantly filling my wine glass, while praising the lake house's natural light and beautiful morning views. Evelyn was also present, sitting across from me, casually dropping comments about how much work the property still needed to be livable. She mentioned that the kitchen felt claustrophobic and that any modern homeowner would immediately tear down the main dividing wall to add value. I cut my chicken, smoothly chewed slowly, and didn't offer a single word of agreement or disagreement to her suggestive remarks. Sienna then brought up the unsigned lease agreement I had given Mark, laughing, as if the high rental figure were a funny misunderstanding. She suggested a revised arrangement where they would pay a fraction of the market rate in exchange for improving the home's value. Mark sat silently between his wife and mother-in-law, staring intently at his plate while pushing his vegetables around with his fork. I set my fork down, dabbed my mouth with a linen napkin, and looked directly across the dining table at Sienna. I asked her calmly if she had obtained any professional engineering assessments before deciding to remove load-bearing walls in my house. Sienna froze mid-sentence, her smile faltering as she exchanged a quick, nervous glance with her mother across the table. Evelyn cleared her throat, defensively, claiming they were just exploring ideas to make the space more comfortable for family gatherings next summer. I politely informed them that any unauthorized physical alteration to the structure would result in immediate legal action and lease termination. The ambient noise in the dining room dropped to absolute zero as Mark finally looked up from his plate, sensing the shift. I finished my meal in quiet dignity, thanked them for the dinner, and left before dessert was even brought out. On Monday morning at 7 o'clock sharp, my locksmith friend arrived at the lake house with his commercial service van. We walked up to the front door, where he efficiently replaced the residential deadbolt with a high-security commercial keypad system. While he was installing the new electronic lock, a white SUV pulled rapidly into the driveway, spraying gravel across the grass. Evelyn jumped out of the vehicle, holding her silver key in her hand, like a weapon, shouting at us from the driveway. She demanded to know what we were doing, claiming I had no right to alter the house without consulting Sienna first. I stood on the porch, holding the master code programming card, and watched her march up the wooden steps with an angry glare. She asserted that Sienna had given her exclusive management rights over the lake house during its renovation phase for the family's benefit. I looked at her with a steady, unblinking expression, noting how her entitlement had completely blinded her to basic, legal property ownership. I informed her that her silver key was now completely useless and that she was currently standing on private property without permission. She threatened to call Mark, immediately whipping out her smartphone and dialing his number on speakerphone right in front of me. When Mark answered, his voice sounded frantic, caught entirely off guard between his angry mother-in-law and his mother's resolute stance. Evelyn yelled into the phone that I was changing the locks and treating her like a common criminal on the front porch. Mark tried to mediate, stammering that we all needed to calm down and discuss this over the weekend like a normal family. I took the phone from Evelyn's hand, placed it against my ear, and told my son that the games were officially over. I gave him 24 hours to decide whether he was a tenant signing a lease or a spectator watching his family implode. Mark came to my home late Tuesday evening, looking physically exhausted, with dark circles visible under his bloodshot eyes. He sat on my living room sofa, putting his head in his hands, as he explained the unbearable pressure he faced at home. Sienna was refusing to speak to him unless he forced me to hand over the new keypad access codes to her mother. Evelyn was constantly in their ear, framing my actions as those of an unhinged, controlling mother-in-law trying to destroy their marriage. Mark begged me to compromise, asking if I could just give Sienna one code so they could feel like it was their home. I listened quietly, without interrupting, observing how my son had spent years avoiding conflict by constantly surrendering his own boundaries. I asked him directly why he felt comfortable asking his mother to surrender her property rights to appease his mother-in-law's ego. He had no answer. He simply stared at the hardwood floor, realizing the fundamental unfairness of the demand he was making. I pointed out that he had never stood up for me when Evelyn changed the locks on the very first day. He admitted that he was afraid of Sienna's temper and had hoped the situation would resolve itself without his direct intervention. I told him that passivity is a choice that carries real consequences, especially when financial and legal responsibilities are involved in business. I handed him a final draft of the commercial lease agreement, along with an official notice to vacate if unsigned by Friday. He looked at the documents, realizing for the first time that I was fully prepared to enforce every legal boundary available. There was no anger in my voice, only the absolute clarity of a parent who refuses to enable a child's weak behavior. Mark tucked the papers into his jacket pocket, stood up slowly, and walked out into the cool night air without another word. On Friday afternoon, I arrived at the lake house for the final scheduled meeting with Mark, Sienna, and her mother, Evelyn. The air inside the living room was thick with tension as we sat around the bare wooden dining table in silence. Sienna handed me the lease agreement, but it was completely unsigned, accompanied instead by a list of aggressive tenant demands they wrote. She declared that they would only sign if Evelyn was granted permanent access and full authority over all interior design modifications. Evelyn sat beside her with her arms crossed tightly, nodding in firm agreement as if she held all the leverage here. Mark sat at the end of the table silent, but his face showed he was no longer going to hide behind excuses. Sienna looked at me smugly, believing that my maternal desire to keep Mark close would force me to accept their modified terms. I folded my hands on the table, looked directly at Sienna, and then turned my gaze steadily toward her mother, Evelyn. I didn't raise my voice, display anger, or offer a lengthy emotional speech about respect, gratitude, or family values. Instead, I simply delivered the precise words I had prepared. If your mother is holding the only key and managing this property, has she prepared a cashier's check for the $450,000 I spent buying it? Or should I list it with a real estate agent on Monday morning? The room went dead silent as the sheer weight of my questions settled over the three of them like heavy granite. Sienna's smug expression instantly collapsed into absolute shock. She looked at her mother, whose face turned completely pale without words. They realized in that single, undeniable moment that their perceived leverage was nothing more than an arrogant illusion built on my generosity. By Monday morning at 9 o'clock, a commercial real estate agent from Lake Oswego had officially placed a "for sale" sign on the front lawn. Mark had called me late Sunday night to apologize, admitting that my direct question had forced him to see the truth clearly. He realized how much Sienna and Evelyn had manipulated the situation using my financial generosity while denying me basic respect as an owner. He didn't sign the lease, choosing instead to move into a modest apartment closer to his workplace to regain his independence. Sienna was furious about the public sale of the lake house, but she had no legal standing or financial means to stop it. Evelyn completely withdrew from the situation, unable to face the reality that her attempt at controlling my investment had failed so spectacularly. The lake house sold within 3 weeks for $20,000 more than my original purchase price, due to the hot local market. I reinvested the entire capital sum into a diversified dividend portfolio that provides a steady, reliable monthly income for my retirement. My relationship with Mark is slowly rebuilding on entirely new terms, grounded in genuine respect rather than passive financial dependence or guilt. He visits my suburban bungalow on weekends, helping me maintain the garden without any underlying expectations of financial handouts or favors. I still enjoy my quiet mornings on the back porch drinking coffee while reading the news as the Oregon rain falls softly outside. Setting firm boundaries didn't destroy my family. It simply removed the structural weaknesses that were threatening to collapse it from within. I no longer hold keys to places where I am not respected, and my financial future remains entirely secure under my own control.